Given the items that we have this evening, we'll start with any declarations of conflict of interest. Hearing and seeing none, we'll move on to item number 4, which is remaining open from November the 14th, the public hearing. And we'll start with item 4A, which is continuation of Area 6 small area plans. And I guess the first aspect of this would be is a brief overview from staff maybe, and then we can get into what the discussion is supposed to be as continuation.
Can I just have the computer real quick, please? So I've just brought tonight 2 slides, thank you. 2 slides just as an update. So we didn't reprint a whole new draft, knowing that we didn't really come away with any sort of great changes from last time that we all discussed it, but I did want to refine the TDR map. And so this is what will be included in the plan going forward. So rather than the 2 sort of alternating hashes of the condition of parcels within the hash that contain that, you know, we kind of just directly cleared them out. So the sending areas are the yellow parcels. Those are the parcels that contain the character defining structures. But the receiving area kind of as a blanket does remain the same. So just wanted to show you what that new updated graphic would look like. And then the second thing that we've been working on is in response to some of the proposed amendments from Mr. Yeah.
Do you have an estimate of about how many acres is in the like 30 acres?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I guess the other part of that question I was curious about is what would under the current density, what would be the number of units? I know we're not getting into the
Sure.
TDR just yet because it hasn't been created, but
Under the highway commercial, they're permitted by right at 12. Those properties are right along Princess Anne. The properties like the old hospital that are close to Fall Hill that is on CT are allowed by special use. Right? No, by mixed use, you go to 12. So they're
So
still starting
30.
at 12, but you could bump it up to as much as 24 through the TDR program. Now they only 24. That's only in the receiving area, right? Only as a receiving thing.
okay. But I guess if you're looking at a density of 12 in the sending areas at 30 acres, talking 420 units down the road that could be sent to receiving areas, just in general.
Right. I think we did the math once for the, not for this specific, you know, how many TDR parcels are there, but for, if every parcel were to take full advantage of the additional incentive of either using TDR to its full extent or using affordable housing to its full extent, it creates throughout the entire area an additional 380 units throughout the entire area.
And TDR wouldn't create new units. I think that's kind of the caveat here. It's just a shifting. The affordable housing would be that increase, and both would be programs we'd have to create.
Is there a limit on how many TDRs a receiving property can take?
Yes, there is a maximum density, but, you know, all of those numbers are still moving points.
That's what Chuck was saying, and just, so let me show you over here. Along the T5M area, so if you're looking at page 189, the the darker purple, the max onto those parcels would be the 24, and then the lighter color, the max would be 16. So it's a gradation to kind of taper down towards the residential areas.
Bring up one more issue.
Yeah, just yell. Well, let me bring up one more issue, sort of a nuance, but I think it's important for you all to sort of weigh in on this. In the lower right corner of that map, the yellow area that is not in the red striped area, that is between Caroline and the river, that area is in the flood way. But it is still zone highway commercial, and they could still have 12 the property could have 12 units per acre by right, and that they, I'm sorry, they can have 48 units per acre, but because it's in the floodway, it gets reduced in half to 24. So it already has a reduction from 48 down to 24 based on the acreage that's there now. One perspective is, you could say, gee, that really is not a good place for residential. Even if it's on top of a parking garage, even if it's elevated and they spend a lot of money, and which in theory they could do, and the premise is those units are going to be prime units right on the river, so you're going to sell them $1 million units, whatever. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's the property owner's concept. There has been some folks that have said, it's in the floodway. Do we really want to give them the ability to transfer units out of the floodway that some people don't think that the developer would actually be able to do because it would be so expensive? So it's kind of playing a game of chicken a little bit, Will the developer, will the property owner spend the money necessary to plop a couple dozen units on top of a parking garage? Or should we say, no, we really don't want that to happen, and we're going to give him the ability, or whoever eventually owns property and develops property, to transfer that elsewhere? So it becomes a question of, should we just give the opportunity to transfer the units out, or should we say the probability of that occurring is in some people's opinion, so low that we shouldn't provide that as an option? And I just throw that out there for commissioners to think about. And I mean, the rest of the properties, everything else on there that's in yellow is something that occupied by an historic structure. So this is the only, quote, environmental. At one point, we had other environmental properties with steep slopes, et cetera, but then it got too problematic, and we wanted just to keep it simple. So this is the only environmental property that struck us as there was a good logic, I think, to say, no, let's transfer the units out, but then there's the other logic, well, the expense of developing is so high, we're giving the owner of the property to transfer units that he probably wouldn't be able to develop anyway. But that's, like I say, a gamble. Anybody has any thoughts on that, but
How does that, that discussion you just had, this map here of sending and receiving areas, I'm not sure that the answer to that question of how commissioners feel. Are you suggesting that could lead to eliminating it as a sending area? Because that would still give the owner, the right to build on that property.
right. We wouldn't, I don't think we want to be in the position of, quote, down zoning his property and
Right.
taking that development potential away from him. But the thinking is that it should not be shown as a sending area, because he would be able to send things that, from some people's perspective, isn't usable on their site. So we're giving him something we're giving him units that he can't really use, at least in their opinion. Now, I've seen the developer's plans where he says he's going to do that, so I don't know who to believe there. I mean, we don't have an approved plan. He's not submitted a detailed site plan. I mean, it's not a vested. Well, vested isn't quite the right word. It is not a fully entitled
Approved.
use of that property in a sense, but having a site plan approved, et cetera. But, staff's initial thought was, we should really just doing whatever necessary to transfer the units out of there. But I hear the other side of it, that we're giving him something they really probably wouldn't use anyway. So it'd be helpful for you as a commission, I think, to sort of have some thoughts on that, one way or the other. That can be a rhetorical question at this point, and we can come back to it later, but it's fair for you all to weigh in on that, I think.
Did you say he could transfer 48 or half of that?
The way where I think we'd be thinking it'd be just the 24.
Just the 24?
Yeah.
Yeah, my general thoughts on that are, I think that the structure that's within that property is a significant contributing structure, and I would really like to see that redeveloped into a quality use. So I, for one, don't have an issue with including that entire property as a sending area, because I think it helps facilitate having that project move forward. And I don't want to speak to whether or not the the owner would spend the extra money to actually put something there if we removed it. I mean, I don't know that, but to me, this is an incentive concept that we will be seeing again down the road, but that would help facilitate preserving structures. And I think that if that's the intent, I wouldn't have an issue leaving it as a sending area, because I think it helps further that goal.
Right, and I'm specifically, just to be clear to everybody, I'm talking about the yellow area that's not in the red stripe. The portion that's to the right of Caroline that's in the red stripe encompasses the power plant properties. So I just want to be clear, it's outside the red stripe area.
So while he hasn't submitted plans, you've seen the concept, and it includes a development that includes the non-striped area. It's not just the historical structure.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Any other questions or comments? Thoughts?
Well, if you have any thoughts on it, let us know, but at some point, but I wanted to include in that loop. All right, I'll stop digressing.
Okay, so we do have,
I think Suzanne had a couple more things.
oh,
I've just got that, and then the second thing that we've been working on is more of an open space inventory, knowing that one of the issues that was raised by Mr. Pates and some of his proposed amendments and the things that we've talked a lot about too in relations to third spaces and open spaces, dealing with walkable ranges and those kinds of things. So I wanted to look at that a little bit more closely. So we've done that initially at a citywide scale, and so the blue is a buffer of anything that we deem a park, open space, plaza, a playground, any sort of intentional gathering space. And then it's a quarter-mile walk, so 5 minutes. And so zooming in on Area 6, there is a little bit of a gap. So we feel that this gap would be filled by the plan by addressing the concept of opening up the high school for more community use, because that's right where that is. And then additionally, in the redevelopment scenario for T4M and T4M, where we've got those two kind of parks identified, the one sort of informal green space that's next to the hospital, and then as well, if the Elm Street blocks were to redevelop and we were showing a potential park there location specifically to be determined, that would fill in that circle as well, that gap. So
Just to point that out on the screen, sorry to reach over.
you're fine.
If you look at page 187, in that redevelopment scenario, you'll see a green open space here. And if you extended the buffer a quarter mile off of that, you're already out here. And then if you look at the other green space Susanna mentioned, which is on Germania Street, which is roughly here, you extend the buffer out again over here. That fills that portion of the gap. And then part of this plan that we all put in together, which I think is good, is encouraging opening up these big school facilities for more public use, which we would then shade in as well, and that would fill the whole gap. So just wanted to show you that on the map.
Can you expound on what you mean by expanded public use of the JM property?
Yeah, so we've got that written in under the discussion of civic use, which is page 186. Recognizing that the high school does have a lot of specialized facilities. It's got tennis courts, it's got a track, but it's not, necessarily used during the weekend where residents could easily go running on the track, because it gets locked up or is otherwise sort of just seeming reserved. So just to find more ways that we can work together to use our city amenities, school-owned or not, for everybody.
Okay, so you're specifically talking about the track, the fields, the auditorium?
Right.
Okay.
Now, when Mr. Pates brought this up, I was a big fan of supporting it. Quick question: how did you come up with a quarter mile away? Is that a
5 minutes is a very comfortable walk.
Okay.
It's really just as simple as that. I mean, we can look at what it looks like with other distances and things, but
Quarter mile is kind of a standard. When you're looking at what is a community walk.
okay?
You may notice that most shopping malls from end to end, at least in the region, is
Okay, because, and the big reason I ask is imagining a lot of young families taking advantage of these types of parks, and I think we've all moved 2 or 3 young kids with us at a time. A quarter mile is a long way to do that, and so just would be curious to have a few more scattered opportunities, which it sounds like we might have. So, thank you.
I was just going to ask if, I'm not sure it was baked into the last version of this document, but whether or not the recommendations of quarter mile and for the city to study potential locations, because if you look at the property that's on the west side of Route 1, while they do have the trail along the river, they really don't have as much of a public park kind of piece. I think it would be nice to have one there and some others on the other side. And I didn't know how y'all thought you would address that in
Yeah,
the.
we talked about it, in the part 2 of the comprehensive plan, in the big piece, in the big, the full plan itself, there is a section that deals specifically with parks and open space, and then there's even a standard that talks about we should have this many basketball courts per this many residents and this many libraries per resident, and it's pretty detailed in that way. So if we wanted to do something, I think really that kind of a ratio of there should be a formal green space within so many feet of somebody's house, it applies beyond Area 6, and that kind of a standard really should be adopted citywide and would go to part 2 of the comprehensive plan is how we discussed it.
Okay, thank you.
And looking in general at that area of the city, it's pretty built out. I mean, there's not obvious areas to target, but if you look at 187, there are 2, and that's what we included in that T4M redevelopment scenario, that there is an open parcel next to the hospital, it's owned by the hospital. That makes a ton of sense. And then however those parking lots redevelop, having some open space there too would make sense. We were thinking along these lines already, we just didn't have the graphic prepared, so.
And that's really all we've brought for sort of new things for discussion. I think our goal was to see if there were any amendments specifically that you wanted to be added or changed or discussed that we could integrate, and so that we could move it forward.
Mr. Chairman, before we get into Mr. Pate's extensive recommendations, I've got a few things I want to point out. It's really about, so if you look on pages 128 and 129, in the description of Transect T4M and T5M, specifically in both sections in the building height section, those sentences they're problematic. They've got some commas missing, et cetera, that make them difficult to read and understand. So the larger point is that if we eventually we're gonna vote to move forward with your plan in some form or fashion, I would, instead of going through every single word in this document, I would just recommend that we have give staff the ability to do some perfecting changes to the document after we take action, rather than waiting, additional time for us to go over the fine-tooth comb every single word and every single comma.
So you're saying liberty with grammatical edits, okay?
Grammar, syntax,
Okay.
just for readability. So for instance, on page 128, it says, 1 to 3 stories with 4 stories appropriate under special review, appropriate transitions where areas meet single-family detached neighborhoods are appropriate. And I read it that way without any pauses for dramatic effect.
Got it.
Okay. Mr. Pates, good evening.
Thank you. Sorry, I just got delayed tonight. Yes, at our last meeting, I had circulated 7 amendments that I have to the small area plan, and you have those before you tonight. And the idea on these amendments was not to be changing the language. in the, for the most part, in the plan, but to suggest some changes that the staff could then take back and put in final language that could be voted on at our December meeting. Because I believe we have until December to finalize this, but I didn't want to try to actually rewrite things and to have some discussion to see if there's support for these amendments. And so, with your indulgence, I would just go through them in the order that they were presented. Does that sound okay?
Can I get a point of clarification? Didn't we go through these last month or at our last meeting? I thought we discussed the changes.
We didn't discuss Mr. Pace's specific text. We did not. We were right at that point, and it was 10:15, and
Right.
we had a couple things to do, and we quit.
Okay, so the red highlights were just staff changes.
No, they're Mr. Pace's proposed.
No, in this one.
No, those were the staff changes.
That's what I'm
Right.
getting.
In the
Okay, my
green,
apologies.
Yes.
Okay. The first amendment that I have is to rewrite the revitalization section of the area plan to focus on the goal of revitalizing the Princess Anne Street corridor and the Route 1 bypass corridors by making them more attractive and viable as commercial destinations and encouraging the preservation of certain historic structures in those areas. The section would list at least 4 or 5 possible alternatives that the city might want to explore to achieve these goals, but would not endorse or adopt any single alternative. And on this amendment, you do see this was the one section where I went in and worked on the language. And I won't go through all of it, but the main point of it was really 2 things. One was to remove the use of the transferred development rights for the purpose of incentivizing affordable housing in Area 6, because I did not think that we were in a position in this area plan to be endorsing any particular approach for promoting affordable housing. We don't even have a definition of what affordable housing is. It's my feeling that while affordable housing is an important issue and one that we have talked about on occasion, affordable housing is an issue which needs to be addressed by the City Council and by the Planning Commission for the city as a whole, and not to be using Area 6 as the vehicle or laboratory for taking one approach. And so I think this revitalization, the purpose of it should be to reinvigorate these existing commercial corridors and also to promote the preservation and protection of historic structures that's already in the plan.
Jim, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Where is affordable housing mentioned in that section? It talks about mixed use. I was confused because I didn't see anything on affordable housing in that section. Was that included in that?
It may have been in another section. I was looking for that myself. I know that it's in the challenges and solutions section, but you may be right. So I may stand corrected on that.
Yeah, it does reference mixed use, and obviously the intent is a higher density, so, but I didn't, when you brought up affordable housing, I didn't remember seeing that, so I was trying to figure out where.
But there are several mentions of it, and that was actually another one of the amendments. It was amendment number 4, and I had listed there that it was mentioned on pages 128, 129, 184, 188, and 196.
Okay, I see it on 184 about increased housing opportunities, low and moderate income households.
I may be wrong on that. I'd have to go back and look at all the different references that I had found, but it may not be in this section.
Okay.
But certainly throughout the document, the TDR is mentioned as a vehicle for promoting affordable housing. But instead of focusing on one option, and I think the reason, and we've discussed this before, that we don't know yet how the TDR program would work, and I think it's premature to single that one option out as a means for achieving these goals. But I list there, I think there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 possible options. I'm not opposed, certainly, to the idea of the TDR. I think it's a useful concept. To my knowledge, it's untried in Virginia for promoting preservation. It might work, but I don't think that we're in a position at this stage of the game in this area plan to endorse it as the approach that we want to follow. So I list there the potential strategies and tools for revitalizing these commercial corridors. And these strategies include, 1, the transfer of development rights from sending properties that have architectural or historical significance to potential receiving properties that need revitalization. That's one. The second one would be the creation of a new historic district with architectural controls governed by the existing or a new architectural review board. Number 3, economic development incentives and grants through the Opportunity Zone and the Economic Development Commission. 4 would be a special tax district that could fund a revitalization program for these 2 specific corridors, and that would include landscaping, facade improvements, lighting, and signage. And lastly would be the creation of a new strategic properties acquisition fund, which was Mr. Harnung's idea, which I think is a promising one, to purchase or obtain easements on historically significant structures with an eye toward their rehabilitation and reuse. While I think it's important that we promote the revitalization of the 2 commercial corridors in this area, that there may be different approaches that are best suited to individual properties or the different corridors. I personally think that there's a big difference between the Route 1 corridor and the Princess Anne Street corridor. Route 1, I think, is viable for revitalization as a strictly commercial area. This is on a 4-lane divided highway that has traditionally been a regional commercial center. I think with the amount of automobile traffic that it can continue to be and can be improved as a viable, attractive, and successful commercial corridor. So I'm not sure that Route 1 needs all this additional residential use. I'm not sure that the Route 1 corridor is appropriate for significant new multifamily residences. I think we have to think about whether or not Route 1 really is appropriate for residential use right along the highway. So this would be general in nature and just simply list some of the tools that might be appropriate as we move forward. So, so my amendment would not even necessarily need to use all the language that's here. And there might be some other changes that staff would feel are appropriate. I know Mr. Johnson stated something about, was it here that, talking about identifying revitalization areas that may be needed. So my amendment is to modify the revitalization section to include that the language in the last paragraph about identifying potential strategies for accomplishing this goal. And I would so move.
Questions, comments from Mr. Pates? I have a second. I think the proper order is, since we don't have a second, that motion does not move forward.
Okay. Moving on to the Second Amendment.
Sir,
Mr. Chairman, if I may make a comment? I, with one exception, I really don't take objection to Mr. Pates's text in red. I think it enhances what we're talking about, and with one exception, I don't think we as staff have an issue with those elements. I guess there's two exceptions. One additional text that I think needs to be carefully thought about is the second bullet. The idea of creating a new historic district in the traditional sense, I do not think will aid the revitalization of this area. I think it would become something burdensome to redevelopment of the area. I think preservation is an important thing that in this particular area should be incentivized, not made as a requirement. So with the exception of that second bullet, I really don't have a problem with the other text. The other element is the text that's proposed to be deleted. Admittedly, it gets a little detailed and a little nerdy, but that was on purpose. This concept of declaring this area revitalization is directly because of the state law that said that proffers for residential rezonings can only be accepted if there are certain criteria met in an area. And one of those criteria, that it be declared to be a revitalization area, and that there are to be defined concepts as to what makes it an area in need of revitalization. And the text that struck out identified issues such as age of structure, abundance of surface parking, et cetera. So while the text is a little nerdy and Mr. Pates's text is a little bit more aspirational, which is a good thing, I would ask that we leave in the text, if you do consider to move forward with this, that we would leave in the text that is struck through. But I would like the commission to discuss that second bullet if you do want to consider this, because I don't think it will serve the ultimate goal. Now, we do talk elsewhere in the plan about a conservation area, which is a more, quote, voluntary form of historic districts where the criteria are not as specific or stringent, that are more guidelines and strong suggestions as opposed to requirements and sitting in front of a board and having them tell you about your vinyl window, or you don't like that, or you do like that, or whatever. So we do talk about that elsewhere, so I think that the conservation district that helps preserve the character of the neighborhood is already present in the plan. I do have significant reservations, though, about a historic district in the traditional sense of that.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Hornet.
I hesitated, almost seconded your motion there, because I did like a lot of the language you had in here. My main concern, and why I was hoping that we could have a discussion without a motion being made, is that some of the potential strategies, I know you have some concerns with the TDR, and we have a lot of things to work out. My concern was by adding those in, or making a motion to add those in, there may be some of those also that have similar concerns that we haven't had an opportunity to discuss. I think all of them are good ideas, but it was didn't want to necessarily make a motion to kind of add those to the plan without having a further discussion on them. But in general, I would support adding Mr. Pate's language in most of the body of the text. It makes excellent points about the types of revitalization we'd like to see in that area. I think that those are all very, very good and strong. And I do like the idea of mentioning potential strategies that he's done, but maybe a little bit more generally than getting into specifics. I do like the transfer development rights, and like all of you here, I think we'd love to hear more about the detail before moving forward. But from what I understand, don't we need to include it in this area in order to?
There isn't a chicken and egg kind of situation here where the state code specifically talks about the TDR being referenced in the comprehensive plan before we can kind of move forward with discussing an ordinance. And the specific state code references talking about the comp plan identifying the sending and receiving area. That isn't entirely logical to me, but that's how the state code reads. And
Can you explain that a little bit more? I'm trying to, the state code says in order to have what, you have to include TDR?
It is specific enabling legislation for transfer development right programs. And there's like 2-3 pages of criteria of what that program would include. And one of the bullet points, one of the items is that the comprehensive plan identifies sending and receiving areas.
So, but you're saying the state code says you have to include that? Every jurisdiction has to include something on TDRs?
If you choose to do TDR, this is how you would do it. That's how,
But there's nothing else that having this in here, that you have to have this is a contingency for having something else in the ordinance?
No. If you wish to have TDR, then you gotta do it a certain way. That's how the nature of the law.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to respond a little bit. First of all, Chuck's comment about the historic district. I'm certainly not wed to that, and I don't know what the chances are of it happening. But let me ask this. In every case that I've ever heard about conservation districts, it has been residential. Have you ever heard of them being used for commercial areas?
I've seen them used like in neighborhood commercial areas, so I think the idea, to summarize the concept of a conservation area, is that you would have, as in a traditional historic district, you have guidelines that supplement an ordinance that says that any new construction or reconstruction or any demolition must obtain a certificate of appropriateness from an architectural review board. In conservation districts, there is not the requirement of that, quote, certificate of appropriateness from an architectural review board, but there are standards that typically are administered by staff, and the standards are, as it is chosen in each community, the standards are either made very strict and very specific and mandatory, or they're written as guidelines, suggestions, criteria, and that would be something that the shades of gray there, we would determine as we would go forward, but it is intended to give developers a guide of what's expected without it becoming just absolutely mandatory and nuanced in its detail. The focus of conservation district is sort of structures, mass, and scale, as opposed to, do you have vinyl shutters? I mean, it doesn't go so much to that detail. It deals with the general character of development. If Mr. Pates is comfortable with, maybe we could evolve that second bullet into reference to a conservation district for both residential and commercial areas. That's consistent with what else we have in the plan.
Yeah, I certainly have no problems with that. I mean, I'm not sure I buy the idea that historic districts are discourage development. I think historic districts can really boost economic development.
And I don't disagree with that. In many instances that they have done, I think in this particular area, the nature of the historic structures are elements as opposed to an entire street frontage, if you will. I mean, it's not Caroline Street where every structure going down is historic. It is a scattering of that gives a flavor, a spice, if you will, as opposed to a meat kind of.
And I think that is a big distinction between our historic district and this area. I mean, no question about it that the whole streetscape isn't one that you're out to protect and preserve. So I have no problem with changing that to a conservation district. But But to go to Chris's point about the TDR, I think there's a very easy way to address that issue, and that is that this area plan at this stage would not identify these sending and receiving properties specifically, but then once we have the ordinance and adopt it, then at that time you would simply have a comp plan amendment that would include that identifying those properties. Because, you know, I think there's considerable debate about what are appropriate sending and receiving properties, and we haven't really looked at them individually either. So I think that's
I
one.
think we have had a lot of discussion about that, Mr. Pates, and I don't think there's any downside of identifying the sending and receiving areas now from the standpoint that we would still have to adopt an ordinance for it to be implemented. I mean, simply identifying the comprehensive plan doesn't make it happen. You have to have the follow-up ordinance. So I don't think there's a downside by identifying them.
Mr. Chairman, I've got a comment about,
So, just 1 minute.
Yeah.
Mr. Rodriguez first, and then I'll come to you, Mr. Durham.
I wanted to get a little bit more understanding about, in this district here, how many properties would be considered historic? I mean, I know the ARB had said there's contributing structures, but, you know, I mean, we had a comment a while ago about like the administration building, you know, it's built in 1970 and it's about to be historic based on different standards. So how many properties?
The map that we've shown before, we could have the computer, please.
Yeah.
We've identified 30 character defining structures.
Okay, but I mean, there's tons of houses and things that aren't businesses. You know,
Right.
how many of those would be considered? I mean,
So we kind of tackled the historic properties in two ways. The first being that in the commercial areas that they were so scattered that we were able to specifically identify them. Whereas in the residential neighborhoods, their historic significance is in their collection. And so that's why we're advocating for things like the pattern book or the conservation district, because it's not one house is more historic than it's one next door. It's that together the streetscape is a historic residential neighborhood. So we're kind of handling them differently because their qualifications for significance are different.
All of these structures are commercial.
oh, I agree with you, but if we're gonna potentially make a conservation district, we just don't need to preserve necessarily commercial buildings. I mean, if that's what we're looking at doing, you know, there's like Elmhurst and
Not
other places.
necessarily. I mean,
I don't know.
you can create, you can create a conservation
could.
district in lots of different ways that has different types of properties. So, I mean, it's just a very general concept. It's nothing specific about it.
Okay. Well, I'm just trying to understand that process. I
Yeah.
mean, you know,
As we've discussed it, a conservation district would be appropriate in the residential neighborhoods if the majority of neighbors and wanted to come together and advocate for that and ask for it, and we would make that happen then.
all right. But if we designate it in here, would we, and the city council ratifies it, then we wouldn't need to go to each of them to develop their own book, I guess.
Yes, we would. It just allows them that if they wanted to, they could. They have the power to. It's not
I guess
establishing anything today.
Well, I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out. Should the planning commission and city council establish those standards, or, you know,
Eventually, that council would have some role in. That's, as it's elsewhere in the plan, that this is something plan says is to be initiated by the neighborhood. So, neighborhood is not an advocate for this. It's a non-starter. And we're saying that this is not something that we, the city, are interested in doing that.
okay. Well, I guess I would assume that we'd already have a feeling of that based on all the extensive interviews and going to community meetings and you all working with businesses.
Continue to be suggestive, but until they say, yeah, we really want to pursue that, we're trying to avoid any appearance of this being a top-down, something wrong. We're saying this has to be from the neighborhood, and we will enable it if that.
Okay.
Kind of like we get in a framework, and then you can determine what you want to do inside of it.
All right. Okay. And then just my other question to that is, practically, if we were to encourage a historic district or a conservation district, how would that? What's the practical sense? I mean, who initiates that? How does that get ratified? Is that?
In the conservation district, as we've identified elsewhere, if it's something that property owners
Okay.
themselves to do it, a classic historic district is something typically top down. Now, groups of property owners can come forward and request it as well, but it is something that comes staff and
Okay.
Mr.
Thank you.
Durham.
I understand Mr. Pate's concern about the use of the term affordable housing throughout this plan. But I do want to point out that, I'm reading from, so everybody's tracking, the Fredericksburg City Council 2036 Vision Statement. This is the July 2018 status. So priority 14, review and update the zoning ordinance, including examination of those ordinances that adversely affect the livability of neighborhoods. So the July 18 status states, Area 6 UDO text amendments are under conceptual development. The core concept is a new zoning district called the Creator-Maker District. Additionally, zoning concepts including affordable housing zoning and transfer of development rights are under conceptual development. These concepts have been the subject of neighborhood and property owner meetings, as well as work sessions with the Planning Commission and City Council. Work on these concepts will continue into the late summer, early fall. So I just want to make the point that council is certainly aware of the prospect of affordable housing inventory being contemplated within Area 6. So we shouldn't have the idea that that's not the case, because it is the case. I'd also like to ask staff if there are any other areas, small area plans that contemplate concepts for increased affordable housing. So I guess the question is Area 6 singled out in some manner?
At this point, we've gone through and done Area 3, and it was not called out specifically in Area 3. The focus in Area 3 along the Route 3 corridor was focused on the shopping center redevelopment area. And we are currently in the midst of the downtown plan, and I suspect it will become more of an issue in the downtown plan because it addresses the adjoining neighborhoods as well. So there will be some address, it will be addressed in each plan as we go forward.
So affordable housing is not unique to Area 6?
No, sir.
Thank you.
And you may notice, if you look at the council priorities down in priority 33, where they specifically have stated that issues dealing with homelessness and affordable housing are to be addressed.
Right, and the way, in the lexicon that city council is using, they're using affordable housing to run the gamut, everything from low income to workforce housing. Is that accurate?
I think they mean workforce housing. I think that's, when they say that, I think that's what they mean.
Well, I think, maybe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe they mean both, but I think they want to focus on an increase in inventory of workforce housing. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay.
So, just 1 minute, Mr. Pate, because I want to just bring up a point you mentioned about Route 1 and housing on Route 1. And I guess we talked about this the last session, about the setback, and you're not right up on Route 1. I mean, because there are businesses there, and there are other things that the housing can occur, behind that. So I didn't know if you were just speculating that these could be up on the highway or not. So.
It could be.
Okay, I didn't think that based on the way we were looking at the transects, that's how it was looking. Because we talked about this at the last session.
Yeah, if you're talking about the T5C toolkit, and that would be proposed for the Weiss Shopping Center, we would do the same kind of thing. and that would require that setback
Okay.
off the highway in the green area in front.
That's what I thought. Okay. Mr.
40,
Pace.
40 feet,
Right.
that's right? Is it 40 feet?
No,
The building could be anywhere from 15 to 85 feet off the property line.
So residential units could be built there at the Fredericksburg Shopping Center, 15 feet from the highway.
Yes, sir.
So
okay.
that's what I thought.
I thought it was a little bit further back than that. Okay.
Well, given that, I don't know whether it's
Well, so I was going to get to this point of order. So, because I initially started out saying, comments, and do we want to talk about it? We had to get to a second motion. So I think we're at a point where you're either withdrawing that motion and you're going to come back with the next one based off of the conversation we've had, or you're just going to modify your motion and we're going to move forward.
Well, I guess the first motion's dead, and so my new motion would
Okay.
be to take this amendment number 1 that I have with the change that it would list these potential strategies and tools at the end there that would, and the second bullet would be creation of a new conservation district or a voluntary conservation district to protect existing historic structures. And this would be for the commercial areas, because this revitalization section really is only dealing with the commercial part, right? I mean,
Not necessarily,
not necessarily.
no.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well-
no, and I think the concept of a conservation district is typically not focused on protecting specific historic structures, it's protecting a neighborhood's character. So maybe we could talk about protecting or enhancing the character of a neighborhood or corridor, and just leave it broad like that.
That would be fine.
Okay.
That would be fine. So then that would be
I'm
my-
going to
my
second
new
that
motion.
for discussion. I do have a couple of things. I think I heard from Chuck that some of this language that you crossed out was specifically desired to be included. So, I would like to give staff wordsmith authority to keep the things that they
Sure.
feel are critical for that.
That's fine.
And,
That's fine.
and to wordsmith some other things so they blend a little bit better. So I'll second that with those changes.
So let me make sure I understand. So we're dropping the second one out. We're putting the verbiage back that has been crossed off. That's the proposal on the table?
Yes, plus if there are other changes that the staff wants to make to the rest of the verbiage in there, that would be fine too.
Just to clarify, Mr. Selinsky, we're modifying the second bullet, we're not deleting it.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
But are we including the text, the rest of the text, or is it just the bullets that we're including?
We're including everything else, just the second bullet gets modified, and the strike-through gets unstruck through.
Right, I mean, but there's other additions that are up here.
Right, and as I said, reading through all that, I think all that's, I don't have issues with any of those other texts.
I believe all that was accepted.
Right.
I'm waiting to see Mr. Rodriguez.
What's that?
I was waiting to see if you got a nod
Yes,
as you
sir.
asked a question.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. All right, we have a motion and we have a second. Cast your votes.
That's mine.
This is yours?
Yes.
All right, hold on a second.
Yeah, see, because I don't have it.
Vote to your left. Did you vote for me already?
No.
Very good. Very good.
Okay, now I would ask that, Mr. Pace, you have 6 more to go through.
Right.
That we allow for the comment session before you get to the
Yeah,
motion
that's,
session. Okay,
that's a better approach, I think.
thank you very much, sir. All right, proceeding on.
Yes. So the Second Amendment, if I were to offer it, deals with the idea of reducing the size of the Maker District. What I would propose is that we amend the maps in the area plan to limit the size of the T4M zone to only those blocks fronting on Princess Anne Street, and limit the size of the T5M zone to only those blocks fronting on Princess Anne Street between Canal Street and Bridgewater Street. This would have the effect of eliminating roughly half of the total area designated as the Maker District. And this would also reduce the size of the area shown on map 23 as either sending and receiving areas for purposes of the potential transfer of development rights, and would also amend the same maps to convert the remaining T4M areas to T4, but with residential density limited to 12 units per acre for mixed-use projects. The idea that I had here is that the Maker District with the transfer of development rights seems to me to be aimed at promoting considerably more residential housing, multifamily, and will probably be largely rental housing in this area, and would increase the potential density of our the areas that are currently zoned commercial highway, commercial shopping center, and CT. It's my own personal belief that Fredericksburg already has a tremendous amount of rental housing. It has one of the highest rental rates in the state of Virginia, and that we are limited in our geographic size. We cannot grow. We are stuck with the boundaries that we have, and so we have to be very judicious in the land that we want to designate for increased residential multifamily dwellings. I think that that there's a difference made right now in the plan between the two sides of Princess Anne Street. Okay, on the riverside, it's the T5M zone, which is the highest density that we can have in this plan. On the other side of Princess Anne is the T4M, which is a lesser density, lesser height, and I think that to some degree that makes pretty good sense, that I kind of like the idea of having a differential between the two sides of Princess Anne Street. But I don't think that areas along Route 1 are the same. That's sort of one of my problems with the plan, is that I think essentially the Route 1 corridor is different. It's different in its character, it's different in its potential, and I think that we should probably be treating them differently. As far as the size of the sending and receiving areas, I think that we need to limit these areas, because the whole concept behind the TDR is that certain areas, which would be the receiving areas, are appropriate for much higher density than they currently have. And the receiving areas are supposed to be areas designated as needing revitalization. And I don't think that they all need revitalization. For example, the areas across from the old hospital, that land is currently zoned CT. There's certainly nothing wrong with CT zoning on it, or commercial transitional uses. And I think that the market will take care of that without having to further increase the density of those areas in order to be developed. I think our shopping center areas may be a little bit different, or on the riverside of Princess Anne Street. there may need to be some encouragement there to revitalize those areas through higher density. But I just think that we are designating far too much of the city, and particularly in this plan, for much higher density when I don't think the neighborhood can accommodate it, and I don't think it's needed. I know that the Fall Hill Neighborhood Association is opposed to the TDR generally. I'm not opposed to it entirely, but I think it needs to be much more limited in the area where it applies. So that's just some of my basis. I don't know whether there's any agreement from the other members of the commission on how much more residential density we need in this area. So,
All right. Any comments,
I need to get some
questions?
more. I'll be right back.
I had just a quick question
Yes,
for
sir.
staff. So let's say, for example, the PNC area, I know there's like 8 parcels, but in that area, like for each of those, like what could currently be built without this incentive?
Those properties are generally zoned CT, and it's allowed by right at 8 units per acre, and with the mixed use at 12 units per acre. And we've not seen any interest in redeveloping those areas. And those parking lots, in my opinion, are a blight on that neighborhood and that landscape. And I think it would be wrong to create an opportunity to try to incentivize some redevelopment there by transferring development off of historic properties and onto these vacant parking lots. I really think that they are a drag to further development and redevelopment of the area, and I don't think it's in the best interest of the community to exclude the areas that need it as much, if not more, than any other area within this neighborhood, within these neighborhoods.
And okay, and if it went to T4M, we would be looking at what's the maximum we'd be looking at they could put
They
on?
would allow it by right
It's 8 units. We're not proposing a baseline increase.
by right it'd be at 8, but with TR you could go to 16.
That's what I'm getting at. So 16 per each one of those.
But TDR doesn't create new
Where's
units.
it
It's just kind of moving them around. So
Right.
That's one.
No, I get that part, but I'm just trying to figure out what that place potentially could look like based on this guidance. And I think that's what Mr. Pates' issue is that if you're going to turn that into 100 units on there versus 8 single family homes on those tracks or whatever they want to do with that, or it's commercial.
Well, I mean, those blocks are just 2 and 3 acres in size. I mean, I don't think that they get over 2 acres. I mean, we're talking about maybe 30, 35 units.
And let's
a lot of
illustrate
blocks.
this for you. This
Yeah.
is an important point, Renee. We've spent a lot of time noodling this here. If we get the computer place, the first thing I want to show you is that we talk about 16 units an acre if we get the computer up. And what we'll show you here is that that's basically what you've got in your neighborhoods already. We're talking about a dramatic increase over the single-family homes that you have. So that's one. And then, Suzanne, if you want.
I just want to refer you to page 187, where we've got the redevelopment scenario of what those parking lots might look like, what that CT area in question looks like under the T4M. This, we've done a little bit of 3D modeling too, just at a very rough level, just to see what that looks like as well. Sometimes a little bit easier to look at than a flat picture, but
Right.
the flat picture here shows a mix of townhomes, single-family detached lots or semi-detached homes, and then a few little multifamily buildings with commercial fronting on Princess Anne Street, and that works out to fit within under 16 units an acre.
I'm just, I guess from my perspective, I'm just trying to understand based on Mr. Pates' recommendation, because those properties, right, those wouldn't be considered is that right? That's the ones that you want excluded?
Right, I was taking those big parking lots. out
Right.
of the-
That's what I'm trying to understand, what we lose potential for what it is now versus what it would have been, or could have been, I should say. I just want to understand the scope of our decision.
And I'll say another thing about this diagram here. If you remember in the Area 3 plan, we had a similar mock-up, and we used the picture on the left. It's more diagrammatic to create the form-based code, which is what's under consideration now for the T5C. And that's the element that we would pursue with this zoning district as well. So we're very focused on form. We know that that's the biggest issue. The questions about infrastructure and other things, the levels we're talking about, we think the infrastructure works. We have regional issues with transportation, we know that. One way to combat that is to have people living in one area where we can provide other services, multimodal stuff. But what we would do would be to take that diagram on the left and start building the bones of the form-based code. We'd work back with you guys. You can see that we have a single-family required line, and we would work that out, whether that meant actually a single-family home on that yellow thing or just something that looked like it. And then we would do the same kind of transitional zone work as well. So that's the usefulness of this for us, is to set the base for that form-based code, to control some of what happens when those do redevelop. And I do agree with Chuck. We had to take a zoning action. I think we talked about this on most of the tours, to lock off one of those parking lots, because, you know, they're going to use a parking lot if it's sitting there for long enough, and people just start storing cars there because, hey, that's what you're going to do. And I think that I do agree that having something out there that's so problematic that it requires your zoning officers to go out and enforce to keep it looking okay, that needs to change. That's not a sustainable thing.
That's a lot to say.
If I may?
Mr. Durham?
So if we didn't have a program to incentivize the redevelopment of these areas that Mr. Pates proposes that we exclude from this maker district, what's your crystal ball as to how these areas might redevelop over the years? The areas specifically along Route 1, the parking lots that we just discussed. I know,
I'm not
Mr.
sure
Johnson,
that
you just said that there's been zero interest in redeveloping those lots,
I'm
so.
not sure that they will. I mean,
so-
there's very little attractive about that area now, and I don't, without something that jumpstarts it, that ignites a little bit more activity and diversity of economic development potential down there, I don't think you're going to see much interest to develop
Right.
along there.
Right, and so, say 10, 15 years from now, the future of strip malls and the like, is it expected to be as it is now with tenants in those buildings along Route 1, or will there most likely be vacant properties? I mean, it's hard, I know it's hard to make such.
You're hitting on the marker. Sorry, Chuck, I'm jumping on.
The market analysis that we've had, that was prepared for this effort, as well as we're about to get on a citywide basis, does indicate that typical transactional retail is declining. We're all aware of the increased interest in online shopping, but more than that, it's experiential shopping. It's not just you go to buy something, but you're going to a commercial area that has some sort of unique character and special aspect to it that you just can't find at a regular old shopping center. We have uses on many of those shopping centers that I would not describe them at a highest and best kind of retail activity. There is vacancy in several of those shopping centers. I do not think that the 2 blocks of Route 1 that are included in this maker district are all that different than what is occurring along Princess Anne. We're talking about the 2 blocks between Walford and Hanson.
Two of the best maker buildings are there too. I think we don't want to lose that. It's the hosiery factory that exists up along Route 1. It's currently in auto sales. You used to love to see that preserved. The U.S. Capitol lighting building up there, we want to include that in the tool. There's that little, we stopped and showed everyone the service station there too. Even that building, has its character intact. So we'd like to include all those. And if we exclude them from the tool, we exclude them from the tool.
Yeah, I was just wondering, it just appears to me that in the last, 5 years or so, that there've been a handful of businesses that have gone in that area that have been, I would say, positive. They have added to the character of the community. But there are a lot that have gone in there that maybe don't have a very positive impact on the character of the community. And I don't want to cast aspersions on any one single business, but I think we all can imagine what those might be. And I guess I'm just concerned about the future development of those properties if we do nothing here.
Mr. Pates?
Well, that's exactly why I was thinking that we need to look at different strategies for different situations. This plan basically, as presented to us, has one solution to all the problems, and that is to increase the multifamily units in the city and in this planning area. And I simply don't think that more apartments in the city is the answer for economic redevelopment.
Mr. Page, I think that's inaccurate, and I think you understand that the Maker District, the essential purpose of the Maker District is making. It's broadening the light industrial uses and commercial activities that can occur there. It is not intended to be primarily or overwhelmingly a residential district. It is an opportunity that creates some diversity of residential development within the area. But I think the broadening of the commercial uses will have an equal, if not more important impact on the redevelopment of that area.
And I think all that can be done without TDR.
Well, that has nothing to do, the Maker District is the Maker District. I think you're mixing tools
No,
there.
it's a package.
So, not necessarily. I think the Maker District is expanding the uses. The TDR is a way to preserve historic structures. We as a community do have a lot of rental housing. So does every other community in Virginia that has a university and medical center. We are percentage-wise, we are no different from Harrisonburg, Blacksburg, Charlottesville, Williamsburg, other communities that have those kind of characteristics. And this is not something that's happened in the past 5 years. This has been a percentage characteristic of this community for 30 and 40 years. So it is not a change. It is in fact who we have been for some time. And it is not something new.
It's gotten much worse.
So
Mr. Rodriguez.
yes, I have a question for Mr. Pates. So you live in the Fall Hill neighborhood, and I assume you attend their meetings. What do the people of Fall Hill want? If they don't want this, what is it that they really want? And what are they committed to doing?
Well, I certainly don't speak for that organization by any means.
Well, right now you're in essence doing that.
No, I'm expressing my opinions. I said that the neighborhood association sent a letter recently opposing TDR for Area 6. And I think their concern is, one of their main concerns is that the area will get overbuilt with residential units. That's one of the reasons. I think they also believe that, and I think the letter said something to this effect, that there are other types of uses that could be promoted there that would foster the idea of training and development for light industrial kinds of uses. I don't think anybody has been very opposed to that idea and to the idea of having some of these maker uses. I haven't heard anybody express opposition to that, nor am I. I just think that the TDR is going to end up having too much residential development in our neighborhood.
The staff has met with the neighborhood association at least 6 or 7 times. And in the times we've met with them, and I'm not disagreeing what Mr. Pates is saying. I'm not saying he's not saying what they said to him. I'm not disagreeing with him. But we met with the neighborhood too, and when we talked to them, they seemed to be okay with it. So maybe we need to have more conversations with the neighborhood, with both us and Mr. Pates together, and sort of talk through these issues so we can have a joint hearing of what their concerns are. But again, to reiterate what we've said, is that this is not new residential development. This is moving it around.
Right. And just for my own clarification, the T4M designation in that area would still allow for commercial. It doesn't
Oh,
they do
absolutely.
not have to build residential on
Absolutely.
there. Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I mean, it is possible to have some of those things, even with the T4M, that you know.
What we're really looking for, I think, is mixed-use developments, right? We have a mixture of low-density housing incorporated into light industrial maker-type businesses. So you have a handful of units where people can live and work, taking advantage of these historical structures that have the infrastructure where people could actually come and do these light industrial type things. So to take the Maker District designations away from some of these buildings seems to be at odds with the goal of increasing job opportunities, entrepreneurial opportunities, small-scale housing developments that fit into a neighborhood and don't overwhelm it. Am I wrong or right?
Absolutely right. You're very, very articulate, Mr. Darrow.
Mr. Chairman. I just a quick request, I guess, for some clarification. The actual residential densities of the T4M, the T5M, whatever, isn't significantly more than what's allowed today. Is that correct?
Yes.
It's only with the application or the potential application of a TDR
Yes.
that goes higher.
Yes.
So I feel like, again, we're kind of drilling down to the fact that everyone may have a little bit of apprehension of the TDRs and where they go, but the location of the T4s or whatever isn't necessarily driving
Yes.
the higher density.
Yes.
It's driving the industrial and maker-type uses that we've identified as a potential need and a demand for more employment in this area.
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Finn, did you want to say something? Okay. Yes, sir. Mr. Pates.
Yeah, I think that's actually a good point, that if TDR were taken out of this plan completely, I think it would look very different. And a lot of my concerns would be alleviated because, again, I see the TDR as a vehicle for developers building more apartments in the city, significantly more in this area. And so if that were not part of it, then a lot of my concerns, I think, would go away.
Any other comments, questions? All right. I'll entertain a motion.
Well, if, I don't know if there's any support for any of this of limiting the Maker District size because it is tied to the TDR program. I don't know, is there any other interest in this amendment? I won't make the motion unless there's some interest in it. Okay.
I'm just curious about, like what you said in terms of the size on, I'm sorry. I'm just a little bit curious in terms of on Route 1, the actual, it's the T5M to build that on Route 1. I mean, I think it's a regional issue, but Highway 1 is a mess, especially in that area. And I mean, I know there's probably plans to close off some of those streets as well to maybe push people through there. But I mean, I don't know. I'm not necessarily concerned about the distance to the road itself, but I'm concerned more so with, having a bunch of multifamilies on, at least on the, I guess on the city side, or not, well, that's all the city, I'm sorry. On the downtown side, that's the word I'm looking for. Yeah. On the downtown side, maybe. So I don't know, maybe would it make sense to maybe do a T4 there versus the T5 or on that side? Just for that street, I guess, maybe the street abutting.
Well, I guess my point was that I don't think necessarily the same strategies would apply to Route 1 as they do to Princess Anne Street. I see them as very different. I know Mr. Johnson doesn't agree, but I think that Route 1 is a regional, very busy, traffic-wise area. And with all that traffic, the traffic can be a good thing for commercial revitalization. But I don't think that the way to do that, to promote that, is necessarily by building more apartments in those areas. So that was kind of the genesis of this Second Amendment, was to take Route 1 out of the TDR business. Now, and I think there very well may be some other approaches that will be very successful. I would love to see, the shopping areas, the commercial areas along Route 1, improved. I think they can be very viable. I don't necessarily agree with the market analysis for the long term, and there may be some other things that we can do there. So I'm just not convinced that it's the same as Princess Anne Street.
But
I
if,
think it is because of the because of the congestion, that it makes sense to make provision for residential. So people can walk to places where they shop, or where they eat, or where they work. And because if you don't allow that kind of mixed-use activity, you are forcing people into the car.
They're gonna
so
need
I
cars
I have a question. I think this point was brought up by Mr. Horning last meeting, and that is, in the commercial highway zones, there already exists by right the ability to build residential. And so by putting these transects over, we're giving ourselves a toolkit to have more say as to what type of that sort of development would go into that place. So let's say a developer wanted to tear down the property on the corner of Fall Hill and Route 1 and just put some multifamily thing there, apartment building. Within certain guidelines, they have by right to do that right now. What you're proposing is put additional restrictions over top of that so that we, as the city, can control that and get a better outcome. Is that, I think we had that, I think you, gentlemen, I wasn't on the commission at that point. You had that conversation last.
Also would be creating the form-based code that would enable that level of control that you're talking about.
Right. But the form-based code, yes, but the Maker District Transect also provides additional tools to control that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but understand also that the Maker District does not go south of Welford. I mean, that solid purple area is not in the Maker District. It is only 2 blocks. It is not the whole corridor.
And if we want to illustrate this for you guys, if it's helpful, we're getting ahead into the Area 3 stuff, but I got a slide, because we were talking about multifamily and campus stuff here. Let me see, that's not the right one. Okay. So that doesn't look right either.
And I just want to say, just real quick for clarification, I'm not opposed to making it designating. I'm just wondering, should it be T5 or should we do something with less density on Highway 1 on the downtown side? That was all my question really is. So
Given the nature of being on Route 1, higher intensity, whether it's for commercial uses or residential uses, I think does have some validity to it.
And check this out, Renee, this is kind of the point here. It's coming, okay? That's what the market study says. And what happened the last time it was coming was here on Cowan Boulevard. And you can see how these developments all developed independently. They're all relying on Cowan Boulevard. They're all reliant exclusively on the automobile. So to Mr. Durham's point, we want to do what we've been forcing people to do through the through rezoning processes here along Fall Hill Avenue. We've been slowly getting this integrated road network that takes people off of Fall Hill Avenue, integrates proposed development with existing commercial areas, and even as those redevelop, 30, 50, 100 years from now, the bones are there. So we're trying to get the mold in place so that when this pushes through, 10 years will be one glut, 20 years will be the next, 40 years will be the next one, that we've got this in place. So that we can have a functioning bus system at some point that's more than just, a social service, for example, and this is how we think you do that.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'm prepared to make the motion on amendment number 2 if I can get a second. If there are any takers for a second, otherwise I'll move on.
I'm not really seeing any, Mr. Pates.
Okay?
How about we
We
move
go
to
on
the
to
next
number
amendment,
3.
please, sir?
could I make a motion
Sure.
Okay.
that we change on the downtown side, change that from T5 to T4M as part of that proposal? Can we do that?
Can we get the map back up here? It shows just.
Or
what
am I
that would
reading that
do.
wrong, how that's, right? Because like on 185, what you have is in purple, that's the T5M on the downtown side of Highway 1.
I think one of the planning principles that we attempt to follow is that these streets are corridors, and that if the characteristics are on one side of the street are similar to the characteristics on the other side of the street, they ought to be treated the same. I would really recommend not bifurcating it. We did it on Princess Anne specifically because the southwest side of Princess Anne is immediately adjacent to a single-family neighborhood. That kind of character is not the same on Route 1, that there is transitional areas of T4 beyond the T5.
There's a single family
We
down
did
there.
that to
on the-
protect the neighborhoods on Princess
All
Anne.
right, well, just my thought, that was my motion. If nobody wants to second it, that's fine, but still like to make it. Just trying to figure out a long-term solution, because we're not going to get a widening of Highway 1 there anytime soon. You know.
So that's your motion.
Yes.
Okay. To simply change the,
The
Yeah.
designation on Highway 1 on the downtown side from T5 to T4M.
I'll second that motion.
Yeah, sorry, Eastern is probably a better way. Yeah.
I have a,
That whole triangle,
What's that?
everything on the.
Bridgewater?
Just from what street to what street? From US 1 to Bridgewater?
Streets are marked
Yes.
on there.
that's the downtown side.
I don't know if that.
Yeah, that's the downtown side.
But it's
Okay,
just,
so would it
it's
have-
just the T5M area, correct?
Right.
Right. That's like 1, 2, 3, 4 blocks.
I guess, do we have that city map again? The one you,
Let's see what we got.
I just want to make sure that, yeah.
Take a look at page 185.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I'm trying to figure out, but it doesn't have, this one doesn't have, like, because there's smaller streets in there.
Bridgewater. You're talking about this area between Route 1 and Bridgewater.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
So your proposal is T5M to T4M for those,
Just on that side, yes, sir.
right?
And we'd still leave across the street.
Okay, we have a motion and we have a second. Cast your votes, please.
Discussion? I have a quick question.
Okay?
Yeah.
Sorry?
So can you just quickly describe the major differences between T4M and T5M so we understand what exactly we are restricting from, if we were to vote for this, what would not be allowed as a usage?
Goes to four
So,
floors.
so right now, what we've outlined is the residential density would be different. In T4M, it's 8 to 16 units an acre. In T5, it would be 12 to 24.
Uh-huh.
And-
Hold on, let's talk about it for 1 second, I'm sorry, to cut you
Well,
off.
no.
The CH zoning there is already 12 units an acre, so essentially you would be advocating a down zoning. So that's one critical point.
Okay.
The other difference that directly relates to commercial development is it calls for a different floor area ratio. So in T4M, we're saying 1 to 1.5 is appropriate, and in T5M, it's 1 to 3.
And I think,
Under special review.
I think height as well, did we say height as well?
Height is different as well.
So and again, we stuck with the by right levels, so we would be advocating in this area to kind of lower the intensity below what currently exists in the zoning district.
But it's not there.
Whereas if we don't, we're incentivizing to increase it, so.
But it would stay the same.
It wouldn't increase, it would be the same as what it is now.
Okay, well, right now it's a auto parts store, a vacant building, a cash advance place, and,
Well, that's actually a different lot. That's not,
not,
T-
well,
That's
I'm
what-
talking
that's
from
what
Fall
Brian's
Hill.
talking about, yes.
Yeah.
Fall Hill, on Highway 1, Fall Hill, you've got the,
yeah, I know.
7-Eleven, Hard Times.
yeah.
But that particular lot that you just mentioned is T5C. It's not included in what you just proposed. I think you just proposed the T5, all the T5M portions to go to T4M.
I see what you're saying, the purple, yeah,
Right.
okay,
Correct.
yeah.
You're proposing the dark purple with the dots
The
on the
dark
east
purple.
side of Route 1. So that's
Sorry.
essentially Route 1 to Bridgewater, correct?
Yes, yes.
With the exception of where the title loan place is.
Correct.
Right, and then
Yeah.
that would be Welford to.
Right,
um,
and I mean, and behind that is a doctor's office. I don't see that changing much, but
Any more discussion here? Yes, sir, Mr.
Did you say
O'Toole.
we'd be downzoning this because of this, if this motion were to pass?
We tried to keep the baseline levels the same.
I understand that, but would this require a downzoning? Would be a downzoning for these people?
It would reduce the permitted by right. What's envisioned in the comp plan would be less residential in height zoning rules than what currently exists.
But density-wise, it'd be okay.
It would be less,
How much less?
4 units an acre less. It'd go from 12 to 8.
12 to 8.
but they'd have to tear down the thing in order to have to face that, right? I mean,
No, it's, you talk about, well, I'm not sure, what are you asking, Renee?
in order for them to apply the new standard to the, so like, for example, the chili place, that strip mall, I don't know what that's called, but, so right now, if we were to enact this and the city council approves it, if they wanted to modify that, I mean,
We wouldn't be changing the zoning rules, but
Right.
if we did to master plan, which is our goal, that's what we want to do,
yep,
then it would be less.
Okay.
The intensity would be permitted to be less.
We would probably be end up in a position where I think the city attorney would advise us against doing a downzoning, so it probably would stay highway commercial, and it'd be hard for us to apply the Maker District criteria. I'm just thinking this out loud as you're mentioning
Sure.
all this, because I think our city attorney would discourage a downzoning circumstance unless there was some other outstanding circumstance. So we'd probably have just
Well, it's
end
called
up
future
leaving it highway
planning.
commercial.
Yeah,
I think that's a
that's-
pretty good circumstance to figure out how we want that area along Highway 1 to look.
And where,
Well,
where
that's-
does your intensity go? I think is a good question, and
I think they'd be
appreciate-
incentivized on the other side
Usually,
of Highway 1.
intensity goes away from neighborhoods and towards major arteries.
And that was how we envisioned this plan working. Instead, yes, sir. I'll put-
Mr. Hornick.
I just want to say, that was the general principle that I thought we were working on in all these districts. And if you look at, which area plan? So is that 3? On 3, along 3, we've got a T5C along the main corridor, and then we back to the T4s as we go along. I don't see a huge difference between the two. I don't see the need to break from that strategy. I don't, adding those units, the reality is if you're looking at 8 or 12, someone buying one of those parcels, all that have a pretty significant assessed value, knocking it down just to build 8 units or 4 units, it doesn't make economic sense. So I think we're kind of getting wrapped up around that, and I don't think it meets economic reality. So I'm not all that concerned about it, just because when I look at it, some of the things that have been brought up as concerns, I don't really see between the T5 and the T4 having a major impact on that corridor. So I'm not in support of making that change.
Any other discussion? We have a motion and we have a second. Cast your votes. Motion failed. What is that, 5 to 2? 5 to 2? Yeah, 2-5. Okay, Mr. Bates, moving on to amendment number 3, sir.
Yes. What this is about is if there are, again, if the TDR concept is implemented, and under the current plan, it proposes that you would have added residential density or increased commercial FAR for those receiving properties, okay? What this amendment would do is to make clear that commercial and residential density over and above what is allowed under the current zoning for the receiving properties would have to be approved by special use permit and not be allowed by right. And again, the idea here is that TDR might be appropriate under certain circumstances, but that if you are significantly changing the allowable residential density on one of these properties, that the public and the planning commission and the council should have a say-so in whether or not it is appropriate in that location. And it concerns me that these receiving properties would be able to add significant development and density without any kind of public participation. It should not be something allowed by right. And I think that, like I say, each one of these sites is different. I think sometimes it might be appropriate and sometimes not, but I don't see that as unduly burdensome to anybody trying to develop these properties. So that's the concept behind my amendment.
I've got a question. Is there a trigger to meet the form-based code when you are using the TDR or anything like that? So for example, if we were looking at the commercial shopping center right there, the Weiss, could they obtain additional residential density through a TDR potentially and not have to proceed through, because I think the form-based code practices alleviate some of the concerns that, not all of them, but some of the concerns that Straight just brought up about
They're tied together. They couldn't
transition.
They couldn't get the addition, they couldn't get the residential development without the form-based code. It would be, it's stipulated. To have any residential development on the property, you have to go apply.
On that particular one, what about some of the others, if you were to assemble?
In the whole corridor, that's everything that's in the shades of purple.
So to get the additional density above the baseline, you'd have to follow,
To do any residential development, you would have to have the form-based code.
okay, so we're stripping away, actually. We were talking earlier about downzoning. I guess
We're
what you're,
adding additional standards, we're not reducing what is permitted, we're adding a additional design or development criteria.
okay, thank you.
Anyone else?
Help me understand the properties that have been designated as historically significant. Concerned specifically about the ones along Princess Anne that may be historically significant, but may be in such poor shape that their redevelopment in their current form would be problematic. So does this identification as historically significant prevent a developer coming in and saying, I want to raise this thing and build some multifamily or multi-use development here? So I'm thinking particularly about some of the motels and that sort of thing along Princess Anne. Does anything in this restrict the, no, it doesn't.
It's not intended to require the preservation of any of these things, merely to incentivize them.
So the incentivification is to either renovate them and change their use, or to raise them and build something that has a different use. Is that?
You wouldn't be able, in order to utilize this program, you would have to have a preservation plan for the building and preserve that building. That's the purpose of this tool. If you don't want to do that, you do not have to participate in this program.
But you'd still be subject to the form-based zoning.
Once we get that established, that's the critical
Right.
part about the Maker District, so we can start working on that and get that in place, like we're doing right now with Berry 3. Yes, sir. Once that's in place, then we will have that.
Okay. So something like those motels, if they wanted to take advantage, if they wanted to be the recipient, if they wanted to be the recipient of the development rights, they could build something totally new there.
Yes.
If they wanted to be the seller of the development rights, they would then have to enter into an agreement to preserve and enhance the existing structure.
Yes.
Okay.
In discussing the TDR program with Bill Freeling, the city's economic development director, the issue of whether a special use process was appropriate with the TDR was brought up. This is talking this all through. We've tried to explore all the permutation and combinations. It was his opinion that applying a special use to a TDR would kill the TDR, that no one would go through what will be somewhat of a complicated process to go to a property owner, attain the development rights, and purchase them, and then come back and then work with the city to go through the form-based code and apply the additional units, that then to apply a third layer to that of the special use permit. In his opinion, the developers just wouldn't go through that process. And, you know, do we know that? Is that a known? Who knows? But that was his observation. I would also add that when, assuming the plan's adopted and assuming TDR is listed as a potential option going forward, and there would be a TDR ordinance, this issue of whether there should be a special use for TDR can be brought up at that point again. So this is not the last time that this issue can be discussed. I hesitate to, I strongly hesitate that we, through this planning process, mandate that it has to be a special use. I think we would not recommend in favor of that, but that is something that can be discussed again and should be discussed again. So all issues are out on the table when we have an actual TDR ordinance.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Pete.
Just to respond to that a little bit, it seems to me, again, I don't know what will encourage or discourage a developer, but I'm not too terribly worried about it. I'm more concerned about protecting our neighborhoods. And what this would do is if you had an area that is being revitalized, let's say there at the Amaret Shopping Center, and suddenly now that has significantly more development there than it has today, either commercial or residential or both. Well, that will definitely have an impact on the people who live in that area. And because this is coming about through a TDR process that the public is not part of, and suddenly they find out that somebody is going to be building this big new project that affects them, I think it is only, I think it's really our duty as a city to give those people a chance to weigh in on that project and not to have it by right. So I think, that a lot of times developers would like to have no local ordinances to bother them, and they could just go into the city staff and get something approved. Well, I think this is exactly the kind of project and development where the public should have a say-so. So that's what's behind this. And I think if we put this in the comp plan, it would not mandate it. It would simply be endorsing the idea of a special use permit. So I'd like to go ahead and make this motion as worded there in the amendment number 3, as quoted there.
We have a motion. Second. Seeing none, hearing none. That motion is dead. Okay. Shall we move on, Mr. Pates?
If we can get some traction on these, I may not offer all of them tonight. I don't want to waste everybody's time. My fourth amendment would be to delete all references in the area plan to incentivizing the construction of additional affordable housing units in Area 6. I would propose that we delete all references in the plan, and those are listed on pages 128, 129, 184, 188, and 196, to providing incentives for adding more affordable housing in the city, and to replace them with statements indicating the need to address affordable housing needs throughout the city, particularly for first-time home buyers. The text should suggest that Area 6 is the possible site for a pilot project to encourage first-time home buyers, including condominiums, and that home ownership should be the key. I would also add language that the best way to promote affordable housing in Area 6 and throughout the city is to keep the currently affordable residential neighborhoods intact, to promote home ownership for first-time home buyers, and ensure that most new multifamily units are built and offered for sale as condominiums. I think that there are, again, like with revitalization, that there are many different approaches to affordable housing, and that the city has not acted to endorse any particular plan. I'm not sure myself what's the best approach in a particular neighborhood, but I don't think that using, again, as the TDR, that again is part of the TDR proposal, is to use that TDR as the means of incentivizing affordable housing units in Area 6. I think that there are certainly ways that we can promote affordable housing in the city. Much of the Fall Hill neighborhood area is affordable housing today, and I don't think that it's going to do anything to preserve that and protect that housing by greatly increasing the density of surrounding areas. I think that's all that's going to do, is to drive up those home prices and make them less affordable instead of more. So that's my amendment, if there's any interest in it.
Sorry, Mr. Bay, I missed that part. What did you say would make them less affordable? I mean, I didn't
I
follow.
think that if the area surrounding the Fall Hill neighborhood is greatly increased in residential density or commercial development, that is actually going to drive up
Okay.
home prices in their area and make it less affordable.
Thank you. I didn't.
Mr.
catch that.
O'Toole?
Mr. Chairman, aren't you on a committee that's studying the affordable housing?
I am indeed, sir.
Could you shed some light on this? Would this be helpful to do this particular motion, or do you have any insight that we possibly could get from you being on that committee?
So, I
I
guess,
don't want to put you on the spot, but
I appreciate that.
Oh, sure.
But I
I
will.
do believe that the city is making an effort to look at affordable housing and what the approach should be on a long term. I can tell you that, given what they're doing for the RFP, for the folks who can come in and study and then make the recommendations, I think is the right approach. I don't know that the references to affordable housing within the plan, are cumbersome or detrimental. And I just believe that the city should be given an opportunity to take the approach that it is, given where we are as a community right now. So it's probably not appropriate or in order, but I would not be voting for this particular amendment, because I think the city has an approach, and they need to be given that opportunity.
But does this blend with the approach, or is this, we're getting ahead of the committee's study, or
I would say we're probably getting ahead at this time.
with putting this in the comp plan?
Correct.
Which way? I mean, the existing language or Mr. Pates's proposed language?
Mr. Pate's proposed language.
Can I get a point of clarification? Was there actual motion on that one, or or we're just discussing?
No, we're just discussing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I don't know if, do you
Yep.
want to add anything?
No, Mr. Kent? Excellent.
My concern, and I guess I'm echoing the chairman here, is that it's clear that the city is concerned and has a desire, they have a policy goal to review and address the issue of affordable housing. And I mean that in writ large. I don't mean low-income housing, I mean affordable housing, which is a broader definition. And so the use as it exists now in the proposed changes to the comp plan are in line with the city's already professed policy. By adopting Mr. Pates's language, I think we're actually putting the cart before the horse, and we may be constricting council when they haven't even decided where they want to go yet. So I also would not support a motion that came to support this particular change.
So, I know what you said earlier, Mr. Pates. I mean, you do have 3 more amendments here. Given what you've heard right now, I don't know if you want to go forward with a motion at this time, or you want to continue on with your other amendments.
No, I'll not make a motion on this one, on amendment number 4, and I won't add any others unless there's an interest by anyone else in exploring any of them.
So at this time, what Mr. Pates is basically saying, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, is that given what you read in the other 3 amendments here, 5, 6, and 7, is the commission open to discussing any of these in the event that you might want to support this particular language going into comp plan? Does that make sense, Mr. Pates? Okay.
I'm actually in favor of discussing amendment number 5. I actually agree with Mr. Pates about the importance of addressing infill, and I believe it actually deserves some particular attention in Area 6 because we see a lot of it happening there without much thought or control by the city, in my opinion.
All right, so at least we're open for number 5 there, Mr. Pates.
Yeah, and also number 7, I think.
Yeah, 7,
Some incorporation of that into some of our prior discussions about radii to open spaces, pocket parks within areas. I'd like to discuss that one.
Okay, so Mr. Pates, we're definitely going to do number 5 and number 7.
Okay.
So proceed, please.
Then the amendment number 5 is to strengthen the goal of preserving the character of existing residential neighborhoods. The part of the plan, there's a section that deals with challenges and solutions. And I would propose that we modify bullet number 6 in the challenges section and the bullet number 10 in the solution section. And the challenges part would be amended to read, in the residential neighborhoods, existing single-family streets. Did I mean streets? I don't think streets. I don't think that sounds right. Anyway, well, maybe that's what it did
Just say-
say. Does it say streets now?
I think you mean neighborhoods.
Well,
It may.
you can combine the first part.
I
with the
think
columns.
neighborhood sounds better, it looks right. Existing single-family neighborhoods are being increasingly threatened by infill development that is incompatible with existing housing patterns and streetscapes. There's a growing trend where buyers demolish or modify smaller, more affordable single-family detached dwellings and to replace them with oversized or multiple dwelling units, i.e. tear-downs. This is a problem that we're seeing certainly in the Fall Hill neighborhood, and I think that there is a way to address that in the area plan in a general way. Obviously, this is something that would also require zoning amendments, but at least it would put forward the concept in bullet number 10 that under solutions, we would protect existing residential neighborhoods by maintaining the current residential zoning, preventing tear-downs of existing affordable housing units, supporting the application of pattern books and conservation districts proposed by neighborhoods, and protecting residents from the adverse impacts of new development. This can potentially be accomplished by, number one, limiting setbacks front, side, and rear. 2, reducing building heights. 3, restricting the mass of additions and new units to conform to the average size of other residences on the same block. And 4, prohibiting new or modified dwelling units from blocking the sunlight available to adjacent residential properties. Now, I don't know that we have to be this specific, but I think people get the idea that this is a concept, and really it's not just for Area 6. It's for really all residential neighborhoods in the city to have infill development or when properties are actually demolished, to make the new development compatible with what's there. I mean, I can think of at least 3, 4 examples in our neighborhood and close by where infill or tear downs have resulted in residences that are vastly larger than the adjacent properties, fill up the whole lots, block people's sunlight, and look totally out of place. And I think that this, again, is not fair to existing homeowners who are there, and breaks up the neighborhood and actually encourages further destruction of an existing neighborhood. So I think the city really can do something right here in Area 6 to protect these neighborhoods.
Yeah, so if I may, I think we've seen some areas of the city where infill is done pretty well. And I think that's probably in neighborhoods that generally are higher value homes, larger homes. When you have a home in there that is maybe smaller than the average house on that block, and it is maybe hasn't been taken care of as well over the decades. Somebody comes in, buys that house, tears it down, builds something that's in character, in line with the other houses on the streets. I would submit that kind of infill is probably positive. But I agree with you, Mr. Pates, that in smaller scale neighborhoods, you really run the risk of changing the entire character of a neighborhood when an infill happens and there's not, any kind of form-based zoning that's applied to it per se. So I guess I'm not necessarily in favor of preventing all infill. I believe that even in the areas where there are large numbers of lower cost homes, many of them in some of the neighborhoods in Area 6, that sometimes it makes sense to take a house down and replace it. But there probably needs to be some sort of thought and policy made about what can go in there. And you've provided some potential things. I'm not convinced that they're all necessarily right. We'd have to have, the experts would have to look at them to make sure that they're all supportable by Virginia code and all that. But anyway, I guess my point is that I'm less in favor of necessarily adopting your proposed language than I am in asking staff to take a real hard look at infill and come up with a proposal, maybe based on some of your ideas. I don't know necessarily if it makes sense for us to vote on your particular language right now, but anyhow, that's what I think.
I appreciate Mr. Durham's comments, because that was sort of what I was thinking, that I don't think anyone in the room disagrees with Mr. Pates' overall goal. And certainly that was not our intent by any means. Right. There are neighborhoods where the existing pattern of residential development has setbacks that are less than, that have lot coverage that is less than what they're now zoned, that the zoning is more restrictive than the neighborhood. And to build, if a house burnt down or was torn down or whatever, the regulations would require something that would not be consistent with the neighborhood. And I think Mr. Durham's makes a very appropriate suggestion, and I was just telling Mike, I think we need to go through, so everyone understands on a lot by lot, block by block basis, what the pattern is out there and why we came to the point where we came to. I think it is premature for us to talk about maintaining current residential zoning until you can see those numbers, and we'll walk that through. I'm a little concerned with us saying we're going to prevent tear downs, because I'm not sure we can infringe on someone's right to rebuild their house that they buy, and if they choose to. I'm not certain we can do that. It is an interesting question for us to be at least thinking about now. Many of these neighborhoods are typically single-story structures. Do we say you cannot have a two-story structure? Two-story structures certainly exist in the neighborhood. We have height limits now that are based on relative to the size of the parcel in order to keep them shorter. Let's go through those numbers and kind of show that to you. And certainly the pattern books and the conservation districts are certainly well in line with what we're talking about.
Mr. Chairman.
Moving forward with.
Mr. Bates?
No, I think those comments are all fine. What I had in mind was simply to make something fit in better. And we do that right now with some of our setbacks, like you were saying, and height restrictions. So I think it can be done in a way that I would think could be applicable throughout the city. It's not just this area, and it would have to be done through a zoning ordinance. But I think it's certainly, it's not a radical idea, I don't think, to try to make infill development compatible with what's around it. And I don't think the city's done a very good job to date in doing that. So I think there's plenty of room, and I would, in fact, I'd be happy to make a motion to send this back to staff with this language, to come up with some language for the area plan that they think would be workable.
All right, I have a motion.
I'll second
Wait a
that.
minute.
Actually, if I can continue discussion, I hope I don't go on too much of a tangent on this one. I do have a question. In Area 6, do we roughly have an idea of average square footage of homes? Because I hear you, Mr. Pates, they are smaller homes by nature. My concern is, and people in the industry can speak better to it, of houses are getting bigger. I mean, the house I grew up in is half the size of any house built now. Right. And the challenge of when we talk about rejuvenating an area, how do we go against that trend of larger homes and still accommodate what you're talking about? And if there's
About
Mr.
1,100
Schmitz.
to 1,200 is about the average square
and
feet.
who's making 1,100 and 1,200 size homes now?
Well, again, that's where, and the city if the city has an interest in encouraging neighborhoods that support workforce housing, then this is the sort of thing that they may be interested in providing some restrictions on what can be built as an infill. Yeah, the market for that, for a 1,200, 1,500 square foot home, even if it's a modern one, is going to be different than for a 3,000 square foot home. But there will be a market for that. We just have to, because we are actually trying to attract some of those people that work in the city and want to live in the city and want that work-life balance that comes with living in the city, but they can't afford those larger homes. And maybe they also, those other homes that are smaller just don't come on the market very often. So I just would encourage staff to, it looks like you're going in this direction, but I think this is a good start, but I think there's a little bit of passion that needs to be taken out of it, perhaps.
What's wrong with passion?
We've written a couple ideas here of things that we could analyze, bring back, do some draft language, so that hopefully, what we bring back as analysis supports what we've written and, we can move forward.
Okay, any more discussion, because we do have a motion. I need a second.
I'll second.
Okay, I have a second from Mr. Rodriguez.
What was the
Yeah,
motion?
remi-
Ask
remind me,
sta-
remind me of the
staff.
motion.
We've just, yeah, I think we just asked staff to take a look at some changes for the next meeting. Is that?
Is that the motion?
Well, I made a motion, it was
What
seconded.
what was, so I'm sorry, what
Remind me
was
of
it?
the motion.
To send this amendment back to
Okay.
staff
Okay.
to come up with something that they think is
Okay,
feasible.
no, we're good.
All right, go ahead, please. Cast your votes.
My goodness,
Seven
that's
zero.
progress.
All right, Mr. Pace, moving on to number.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so.
I'll skip number 6.
Correct, sir.
Unless somebody else wants to take that one. And go on to the last one, which is to strengthen the designation of pocket parks and other open spaces for residential neighborhoods. I got this sort of idea that I'm a big believer in pocket parks, and I think that everybody who lives in the city should have some kind of open green space near them where they live. So I did a little research and found some other cities have beaten us to this. And what they have done is generally come up with a metric for planning purposes at least, and say that within X number of feet of residential neighborhoods or residential units, that there would be some sort of open space available to the public. And I think these spaces could take very different forms. I think they could be private. I think they could be public. It could be a playground even. I mean, I don't know what would qualify as a pocket park. But the idea is to plan for this so that we don't end up with everything being developed and suddenly you find that there's no place to take your kid for a walk or something, or walk your dog. And so this last amendment would be to revise the environmental and open space section of the plan, which is page 190, to recommend that all residential neighborhoods in Area 6 enjoy at least 1/2 acre of public open space or a pocket park within 1,000 feet of most homes within a neighborhood. This would mean revising the map 24 on page 189 to designate the general locations where such open spaces are currently needed. In addition, this section would list several strategies for realizing such open spaces, including gifts and dedications to the city, purchased by the city, or amenities that have been dedicated as part of private development. These areas should be described as being different from third spaces, nodes, or other required open spaces, and would be for the purpose of passive recreation and natural parks or green spaces. I'm not at all wed to what I wrote here, and I again would be happy to refer this to the staff to come up with something that they think. I'm sure they've given some thought to this already, and that I think there are lots of ways to accomplish this. And we had a discussion at our last meeting or the one before about designating individual private properties as being, oh, this is where we want to park. And I think the consensus was at that time is that it would be fine to designate the general locations of these and then figure out how and when it could be accomplished. So I would make a motion that would be like the last one, that the staff take this language here in Amendment 7, the concept behind it, and come up with some language that they think would be appropriate.
Second.
Discussion?
Yes, sir.
I support this, but I also ask that if this were to pass, that staff figure out how to incorporate some of the other commissions into this. So we get the Arts Commission, the Memorials Commission, Clean and Green, potentially providing inputs into the usages of these pocket parks.
Yes, sir.
As procedurally painful as I know this will be, but I think the right thing to do is, to achieve Mr. Pates's goal, is this amendment, because I think, as he clearly says, it should be sort of a citywide policy. It probably can be referenced in this section of the code, I'm sorry, of the comprehensive plan. But where it really ought to go is back on page 54, where it talks about standards for parks and recreational facilities throughout the city. And it is noticeably absent the concept of a pocket parks. It talks about baseballs and basketball and golf and football and tennis, and it talks about field activities, but really doesn't talk about these that are more, relatively speaking, more passive. And let us work on this. This may involve mission initiating a different comprehensive plan amendment than what's been advertised. Having another public hearing on that one particular item, because it would be amending an entirely different section of the comprehensive plan if it's to be applied citywide.
Well, it seems to me, Mr. Chairman, that perhaps that could be put off to a later day, and that we just deal with Area 6 for right now. And I was hoping that we'd have an amendment to the map. Do you think that there's time available?
Sure.
To be able to do those designations and put them on our map for Area 6?
Yes, you know, we can do that. Let's work with this text, Mr. Pates, because I don't want to create a more convoluted process for anybody here, but at some point, the right thing to do is to go back into the, what is this section called? Public facility section of the plan, and let me talk to the Parks and Rec and Events Director and get her 2 cents on this, because I'm sure she will have some thoughts on it as well, and just ask the question, why wasn't this included when we did the comp plan update?
Yeah.
8 years ago, 3 years
Mr.
ago.
Chairman, I would just note for the record that I just had a conversation this week with a council member who was talking about that there was this open space, little quote pocket park down by the railroad station, that there's been some talk about eliminating that or making a trade with a developer for land down there, and the neighborhood went wild because this little postage stamp of a pocket park is greatly valued by the people who live there. They're terribly upset that this might go away. And so I think we shouldn't underestimate how important these areas can be, and that neighborhoods often take them for granted because you have a vacant lot that has over the years become their public property, you know. And so I think that people would really appreciate this. That's all I'm saying.
I'm not going to mention Idlewild right now. Because there's been a discussion for Idlewild Pocket Park.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I would move that we refer to staff amendment number 7 to come up with some appropriate language that would accomplish its general goal. So moved.
Did I get a second? Okay, already got a second. All right, please, cast your votes.
I'm through.
Motion carries 7-0. Okay,
Okay, I'm through.
thank you, Mr. Pates. Next item on the agenda is 4B, the continuation of UDOT A 2018-03 Commercial Highway Form-Based Code. And this is just a continuation. So staff want to refresh our memory as to,
Yes, sir. Oops, let me get the right one up here. And here we go. If I could get the computer back. I won't go through everything again. Last time, we talked about kind of where we are in terms of overall land use, looking at the occupied areas of the city and and eventually getting to the areas where we're gonna evolve and noticing, where they are, what their character is. They share similar characteristics, and that they're limited. We really are, I think someone said it earlier today, we have limited square footage and limited areas that we're gonna permit to change. So we went kind of through the standards. The tool is, that we're talking about is a form-based code focused on the T5C, which is this area in purple here. The big challenge is moving from separated land uses that were designed solely for shopping and solely for living when we get the next push, redevelopment push, which is going to come, getting rules in place for strong urban, walkable urban places. So we talk about urban fabric frontage standards, which is the streetscapes, and then lot and building type standards. I won't go through each individual tool, but it's access, blocks, transitional zones, which are critical to step down intensity as you get close to the neighborhoods. And this requirement for formal open space, which is apropos to what we just talked about, it would in fact require these types of pocket parks. I mean, we could have called it pocket parks. Formal open space sounds more sufficiently like, you know, zoning ordinance, but here's the frontages. Here are the building type standard graphics. This is what I did want to show you. I showed you guys earlier. We had one suggestion, and this maybe was in the next amendment, Article 5 and Article 8. I'm getting them mixed up a little bit. So maybe I'll hold off on that discussion until we get to the next item. But that's what we've got. That's where we are. So happy to take any additional questions you guys have. Happy to go through the document. Whatever you all need, whatever we can do to help. That's why we're here.
All right. Open for discussion or motion at this time? I don't know, we talked about it quite a bit at the last session. Anybody need any more clarification on anything?
Can I just ask
Sir.
staff one question? Could you describe the, kind of the direction cities are going to or localities are going to with respect to this? Is this, are we on the front edge of something? Are we on the trailing edge? You know, and what other cities or other localities in the Commonwealth are employing such tools, and have they had the success that they hoped they would?
Well, we're in the front, but we're not the first. And enough localities have gone through that we've seen ones that work. Virginia Beach, and we brought their attorney along in order to help us create this. Arlington's had fairly successful projects, as have Charlottesville, and to some degree a lot of other smaller localities. There have been ones that have failed. Portsmouth was a code that was extremely rigid and inflexible and immediately fell apart. It didn't fall apart. The political coalition that passed it fell apart once it became so onerous. So we've learned those lessons by talking to those folks and working with different groups and bringing in a guy like Bill McAlee, who was the city attorney in Virginia Beach that worked through the form-based code down there, and then worked, you know, through its implementation and its early life, and even as they amended it as they go on, which was something that he encouraged us to expect. So we're not the first, but this is new. This is the direction that zoning is going, and I think I don't know if you have any other questions.
I make a motion to approve this item.
Motion that,
I'll second.
all right, any discussion?
Yes, the motion is to approve this whole ordinance.
Recommend approval to the city council of the text to establish a form-based code within the commercial highway zone
Yeah.
district.
This is a very complicated ordinance, and there's a lot here that I understand, but there are a lot of things that I still have questions about. I'm personally not ready to vote in favor of this tonight. I would hope that we might be able to devote a meeting to going through this ordinance in some detail. So I would hope that we could postpone a vote on this until at least our next meeting.
Okay, well,
We,
Mr. Pitt,
I understand we have till February, I believe.
so, I have a motion and I have a second. So I would leave it up to Mr. Rodriguez as to whether he wanted to withdraw his motion at this particular time, or if he wants his motion to stand, and we go ahead and take a vote.
I would say, does anybody else feel that we need more time? Because I know that the city council, they had a working session on this. We met on this last meeting, and we just got another update here. I'm prepared to vote on it unless the will of the group.
And the second stands?
I just make a comment. I've been involved in this quite a bit longer because I participated with Mr. Craig on looking at it initially. I think this is one of those ordinances that until we get a use coming in we're going to learn a lot when we get someone who comes in and wants to propose to do something like this, and a lot of it may change. So I'm comfortable with it. At the same time, I don't want to assume that everyone else has had enough time to review it. So if it did come to a vote, I would support it, but I don't have a problem deferring if other members aren't prepared to go forward.
I have a motion and I have a second. Unless I have somebody else from the commission that feels that they need to delay. Cast your votes, please. Motion carries 6-1. Okay, moving on to item 4C, which is also a continuation, and it is of UDOTA 2018-04, blocks and lots, access and parking. And Mr. Craig.
Thanks, sir. We did have a follow item up on this item here, and let me find it in the packet. It's in the blocks section, and I believe it's 7251.2. Land subdivided or developed for residential uses or for mixed-use developments with a residential component shall be divided into blocks that conform to this section. It was pointed out that this section does require residential uses, including multifamily, to now conform to the block standard. And the question we got, a good question, was, is there a need to preserve the ability to do campus-style residential uses? So we dug into that question, and I couldn't come up with language that we could apply to this standard that wouldn't kind of counteract the efforts we're taking with the form-based code and other things. And I can show you what I mean. And that's why I've got this slide up here. My computer is like off the slide or something from whatever's on the screen. Logan, I don't know if you know what's going on back there, but if you could help us with that, it's much appreciated. So let me try to open it up one more time. Then I will quit bothering you guys with this. We're reading up there, not what's on the screen. Good man. Okay, so let me remember what I was talking about. So for instance, what we're focused on is, and I think this is important too, really the change that's going to happen in the city is going to be in these areas. And we don't have open land like we did along Calvin Boulevard, say in the 80s, 70s and 80s, where we would propose new kind of multifamily stuff. In all scenarios, here, what we just voted on, as well as, let me get back to this other side, what we've been working on in the newer areas is to try to integrate the uses. And the critical piece here is really connecting the transportation networks so that everything doesn't just have to pour back out onto the arterial road. And that will help in the short term and people just being able to walk around their communities and go to other residences and adjacent commercial uses. And in the long term too, as the 150 years from now things redevelop, the bones will be in place that will enable evolving uses. So what I looked at, I think Chris, Mr. Pace, you guys were asking about this, were there areas in the city where we wouldn't necessarily push for this kind of interconnectivity that you see on the right of the screen? And I just couldn't find a scenario where we would say the campus is okay there. Central Park even, that's already kind of got a gridded kind of shape. We would encourage this kind of thing. So I couldn't think of a way to put a caveat into this language to say, unless adjacent areas didn't already have a block pattern, because a lot of these adjacent areas where we're pushing for this don't have a block pattern existing, and that's kind of what we're trying to fix. I'm still open to that. If there's some way we can something that I'm missing there. I think the options for someone who wanted to do a campus-style multifamily thing would be to ask for an exception to the standards through the city council. They could still do that if the project was worth it to them to pursue that. So that's kind of my update on that one piece. That was the one question I got from everybody, but I'm happy to take any questions on any other pieces of this as well.
Mike and I haven't thoroughly discussed this. Let me ask him a question because he just raised the issue. Is there a possibility of some sort of administrative exception or?
Yeah, this section is subject to it's a development standard. So we have our hard zoning rules that require variance, setbacks, density, building heights, things like that. We can't just administratively waive them. But development standards, we are able to administratively waive them in unique circumstances. Mostly that boils down to kind of physiographic kind of things like there's a huge cliff or something. I'm trying to think of what the examples would be in an RPA stream. And we've kind of built that exception into this, knowing that that's already kind of how we administer this. And if you look at D, it's on page 2, D depth B for multifamily residential uses, mixed use developments with residential component, depth of the block shall not be less than 250 feet, not more than 600 feet. However, the depth of the block may be reduced when a single tier of lots is necessary or desirable as a result of the physiography of the site to conform with an established pattern of development. So we already kind of worked that portion of that in to just, so it wouldn't need to be an exception even, that it's just part of the code. So I don't know if I answered your question, Chuck, but.
Can we add another criteria that it's not just physiography, but also if it's a multifamily project?
And that's what I'm getting at. If you do that caveat, there's no guarantee that people will not take advantage of that. And we won't get this kind of transformation of the fabric that we're looking for in terms of redevelopment. I don't know why someone would, it took a lot of effort to get, if we had the computer back up, it took a lot of effort to get this type of integrated network with these apartment projects that went up on Noble. Actually, they were actually a pretty good company to work with. They were open to the idea, but absent the rule, I don't know. You did? Oh, no, I don't. I'm not sure what you're saying.
Y'all could talk for a minute. Can I, Mr. Chairman? I just,
Yes, sir.
full disclosure, many of you know I previously worked with solar companies, and I did. And one of the issues we ran into, we did have a multifamily project, and at the time we were asked by city staff to lay it out in a grid system. And the particular project was a campus style. And so some of my concerns, just for full disclosure, was specific in how the ordinance and in the comp plan that was suggesting a block standard would be applied to a multifamily product. And at that time, I did not feel that it was appropriate to necessarily apply it holistically like you would something that was downtown or a redevelopment of a shopping center where you already have your networks, the ground is relatively flat and you're laying it out. So that's just, I wanted to make sure you all were aware. I'm not involved in that project. I have no financial ties to it anymore. It was just simply that experience that kind of made me think, is this something that should apply to that type of use all the time? And are there circumstances where you may have a hindrance where someone in staff doesn't agree that an administrative waiver, can it be appealed? And that's what, when you just mentioned that, I think I'd be more comfortable with it if there was an appealable portion of that. Is that correct, that in the ordinance that anything that if staff says, we think you should follow this standard for blocks, and that it could be appealed to city council to review or not.
Yeah, the appeal goes to the circuit court,
Okay?
but the special exception process could go to the city council. That would be a path to the city council.
And is that already codified in the, or is that something that, okay.
That's in the ordinance.
Is that with any issue related on a, how does that work? Anything that comes up
Well,
as far
they're-
as?
They're supposed to be special and unique, so it would have to be some substance of the project. There would have to be a real benefit to the city for the city council to approve that. That's the purpose of the special exception.
Okay.
One idea, and I'm getting lukewarm support from it, from the senior planner, is to slightly modify the standards. Right now, these standards, these numeric standards are applied to streets. That's the concept. And perhaps for multifamily development, we could also say that driveways that are, if you want to, can you bring up,
Yeah, if you go back to the computer, please.
the driveways that form,
So these back here.
that go in between the multifamily buildings could also be I'm not sure how we would phrase it, would be considered streets or could be used to meet the standard as well. And thereby, they would literally have to be full streets, but they would be the driveways within the parking lots. That the arrangement of the driveways and the parking lots could be such that they meet the block standards that we're creating, and that it would create the circumstance very much more similar to what's happened in Valor, which I think is consistent with the general intent, but without having to create full-blown streets with curb and gutter and parallel parking and find a middle, so that in multifamily developments, that would be an option. If you're interested in including that, you can, if you're willing to make a motion, you can direct staff to work out how to include that language and then move it on to council, and we'll just work it out and send it on to council. Or you can wait and have.
Well, I think the days of the campus-style apartment, I do agree with you, those are probably done. There's not a whole lot of land left, but I do think there's a possibility you may have some. So I would like to, I will make the motion. Well, hold on a second. How far are we along in this, and which one are we considering? Are we looking at all these at the same time, or are we have to do one at a
That's the only
time?
outstanding issue that we had on with
Okay.
everything else in.
Well, then, what's our order here? Because I want to make sure we go in the right order.
They can all be considered as one ordinance.
One ordinance?
Yeah, if you just made a motion for all three, they were presented as such.
Yeah, I'd make a motion to approve all three of them, with the exception I would like to ask staff to take a further look at the possibility of allowing, I don't even know how to word this.
Driveways to count as streets for the purpose of.
I think they
lots.
already do though, don't they? In the Valor, didn't they count as the streets? I thought that's how they
No.
got their block
A
standards,
couple
all
of
of
them
their
did, a
parking
couple of
lots
them
were.
did, but a couple of them did.
It was a hybrid.
Yeah.
This standard didn't apply. They built the street network. Chuck's talking about the rear of the parcels. There was two buildings that had a connection through a driveway, or through a parking lot. We gotta be real careful about driveways, drive aisles. That's part of the point of this, is to clean all that up, so, but.
Yeah, I don't know that necessarily addressed my concern necessarily, but I would make a motion to support it, or to pass this on with the recommendation to approve, simply because I think the areas that I had concerns with I do agree are not as likely to occur in the future, and as long as there is a waiver process, I'm willing to support it.
I second that.
All right, discussion?
I'm ready to go home.
Okay, if there's no discussion, cast your votes, please. Motion carries 7-0. Okay, moving on to item number 5, general public comment. Do we have anybody here from the general public that would like to address the commission this evening? Seeing no one moving towards the podium, we'll move to item 6, which is other business, and 6A, planning commissioner comments. Anybody, anything? Yes, sir, Mr. Durham.
Well, since it's my first meeting, I just want to just say that I'm very excited to be able to represent people of the city for the term of my appointment, and I look forward to working with everyone here to make this city a better place.
Welcome,
Thank
sir.
you. Welcome.
Okay, moving on to item 6B, which is planning director comments.
Real
Area
quickly,
7.
oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real quickly, just a couple of issues and talk briefly about where we are with the downtown area plan. Yesterday at the city council meeting, early in the evening, they received a presentation from Dr. Pano of the university master plan, university capital, really master plan of facilities. And perhaps two most significant elements is that they are pursuing a steady stream of capital improvements, renovating, updating, and in some cases even demolishing various residence halls. So that they are moving forward along those lines. And the second and perhaps even more significant issue is what Dr. Pino called a Marshall Plan. That would be a very dramatic change of demolishing the Marshall Residence Hall, which is at the corner of Sunken and William, and replacing that with a large performing arts facility. A major, full-scale, $40–50 million performing arts kind of campus, with the potential of a parking structure of some sort across William Street, adjacent to the other apartments that the university owns. The council, I think it's fair to say, warmly received this idea and asked how could the city become involved financially to sort of help make this happen. And so that it becomes an interesting addition to how that corridor of William Street may evolve over time. But there will be proposals in this session of the General Assembly for monies to, at the very minimum, start the design process for that project. That was interesting. In the evening, the council did finally come to a conclusion on the proposed special uses at Valvoline, for the Valvoline and 7-Eleven at Fall Hill and Hospitality, and voted to approve the special use for both projects on condition that there would be no access out to Fall Hill Avenue. And that was a 6-1 vote. So it was, there was a lot of discussion, a lot of intense discussion amongst council members, I guess is a good way of putting it. But afterwards, the representative of the property owner really had no comment, so I'm not certain where that's going to go. Plans are moving ahead on the stadium project. So that will be moving along through the process as we go forward. If there's any other development questions, what? Oh yeah, I'm going to do that. Oh yeah, thank you. Talk a little bit about the downtown plan. We are expecting, hopefully by the end of this week, the hopefully last version of the market report that is going to be planned to be presented to council at a work session at 5:30 on December 11th. You all are invited, encouraged to attend. We will certainly distribute it to you once we have it. It's about, the core of the report itself is about 60 pages, and then there's another 180 some odd pages of numbers and statistics and background. So that should be, I think, very helpful moving forward. On the next day, which is your December 12th meeting, we intend to, if Street Sense is far enough along, and I emphasize if they're far enough along, to sort of begin to show you all some preliminary thoughts about transacts and policy elements. We saw a draft of those, Suzanne and I saw a draft of those on Monday on a Zoom telephonic conference video thing. So we'll see how they evolve. We'll certainly give you an update where we are on the 12th. We do intend to, at the council January 8th and the planning commission January 9th meeting, to talk, hopefully we'll be much further along with them and sort of show some of the ideas and get some reaction from you guys. The idea is hopefully to have at least a draft plan to be discussed with you all at your February meeting. That's sort of what we're shooting for, and then having maybe a public information session, public discussion in late February to get public reaction and public, make the public knowledgeable about where this is all going. So we do intend to involve you all as these things, I wanted to assure you that, to reach a level of maturity and in their completeness. I guess a general overview is the definite trend is probably a shrinkage of CD zoning, and focusing more on the actual, I think what I would agree would be the core of downtown along William and Caroline and Princess Anne and Sophia, and then some of the parallel streets to William. So it is a and then creating an appropriate transitional area outside of that what I think is, everyone agree, would be the traditional core. So we're moving it along, and we'll certainly keep you apprised as things become more specific. Last thing, I wanted to hand out to you all a proposal, not a proposal, a final draft, I guess is the best way of putting it, of the annual report for you all to read through and mark up. We can certainly provide it in Word versions for those of you who want to get into the nitty-gritty on it, but wanted to give everybody a hard copy of it because it is a lot of paper and it's easier to read this kind of document in hard copy. On the top of it is last year's cover letter. So I would urge, Mr. Chairman, you to designate yourself or some other appropriate party to sort of work on new and improved version of this cover letter. Think about that, and we'll pass this out.
Thank you for that.
I got a quick question for you.
Sure.
2 questions, actually. First question is, when's the next Makers District meeting?
December 13th at 7 p.m.
And
Dorothy
where's that
Hart
at?
Community Center.
Okay.
And
Did we get an invite for that
I
one?
think we did.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah,
We did.
Okay,
Cool.
good.
I see it now.
Yeah,
Sorry,
we're-
I was
we're
looking.
trying to do that. I think that's a good idea to get those Outlook invites
Yeah.
out. So.
And then my second question is, last night in the working session and in the city council meeting, there was discussion about legislative agenda. Is there anything that, like, from our perspective, that we should be asking the city council to add to that list?
I know the legislative agenda includes an effort to be involved in latest iterations of amendments to the proper law. That's a little bit of a moving target of what the nature of those amendments would be. I know the city attorney is closely following those evolutions and is doing her darndest to influence them, at least on the level of having the language to be clear so we can understand what is being said, but also trying to give localities more flexibility forward. So we'll apprise you all as we know more about there are various bills being discussed at this point in time, and how they will work out is one of the mysteries of this session. It is a short session, so they will only have 30 days to sort of work these things through. So.
Any other questions, comments?
I just wanted to let everybody know, unfortunately, I just found out today that I have Navy Reserve duty from the 8th to the 14th of December, so I'm going to have to participate telephonically in our next regular meeting.
Okay,
Having one meeting in December, right?
yes.
Yes, we're just having one meeting in December.
Yeah, where's the Christmas party? The new chairman?
Wait, I'm already sitting here.
Didn't we have one last year?
We did,
At Jim's house.
right.
At
Okay.
Jim's house again.
Well,
Oh, so that means David has
He
to
told
do
me to
it.
put that out.
Since David,
maybe I'll consider something at the clubhouse.
Maybe next year.
Clubhouse. So let me take a look at something. All right. Okay, anything else? Have a nice evening.